Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is the Vedic tradition and UFOs. My guest is Michael Cremo, who is co-author with Richard Thompson of The Hidden History of the Human Race and also Forbidden Archeology. I might mention that Richard Thompson, his co-author, has also written a book that we'll be touching on today called Alien Identities. Michael Cremo is also author of Human Devolution, as well as a collection of his scientific papers called My Science, My Religion. Michael is based in California, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Michael. It's a real pleasure to be with you once again.
Good to be with you, Jeffrey.
We'll be talking about the Vedic tradition and UFOs, and I think it's pretty generally known that flying vehicles are used widely by not only the devas and deities, but the asuras and many levels of beings that inhabit the Vedic universe. And I think it might be a useful thing to begin by talking about how the Vedic worldview is different than the Western worldview.
Well, yes, it's different, Jeffrey, in that it's a more consciousness-based picture of the universe than the Western concept, which is fairly materialist in its ontology. You know, that matter is primary and consciousness develops somehow or other from matter in a way they've not explained yet. But the Vedic cosmos is based on consciousness, that matter comes from consciousness rather than the other way around, that consciousness comes from matter. So it's also a very personalist universe where personality, intelligence, individuality are all built into the structure of the cosmos. So the entire thing is inhabited, and there are communication channels between the different types of conscious beings that exist in the different parts of the Vedic cosmos. And among those means of communication are things such as flying machines, spacecraft, things like that. So that's the basic difference.
One of the things that strikes me is of course, that Western thought is influenced by the Judeo-Christian tradition, which is monotheistic, and the Vedic tradition is, I guess you would have to say, it's polytheistic.
Well, but in a special sense, there is a monotheistic element to it in that there is one ultimate being of pure consciousness that is the source of all the others. Now, all of the others may exist with different levels of powers and abilities. And those with human abilities are on one level, but there are superhuman beings, according to the Vedic cosmology. They're called devas, which in some ways corresponds to the Judeo-Christian concept of angels as beings intermediate between the supreme conscious intelligent being, God, if you will, and ordinary humans, for example. So it's something like that. You could say that Christianity is in some sense polytheistic, if you count the angels as supernatural beings. So similar ideas there in the Vedic cosmology.
In fact, one of the main themes one sees in many religions, including the Zoroastrian tradition and Christianity, is this idea of a war between the good forces and the evil forces taking place in these hyperspace or supersensual realities. And that also seems to be part of the Vedic tradition.
Absolutely. One thing to keep in mind about the Vedic tradition is that every being is ultimately a being of pure consciousness. That is the natural state of a conscious living entity. It's meant to exist on a level where there's no birth, no death. However, we find ourselves in another position at the present moment in the material universe, which is there for two purposes. One is to allow us to enjoy separately from God, to pursue our own interest and competition with others who are doing the same thing. And the competition can get quite intense. So that is one type of living entity that exists in the material cosmos. The material cosmos also offers opportunities for the souls here, the conscious entities here, to come to their natural position and exist in a realm beyond birth and death and conflict and competition. So those who are striving for that are called suras, means saintly people. And those who are going in the opposite direction are called asuras, not saintly people. And they come into conflict. There have been universal conflicts that have gone on for ages. And sometimes the Earth planet is involved in those conflicts between the forces of good, you might say, and the forces of darkness.
One of the most unique features, I think, of the Vedic tradition is that it has always recognized the immenseness of the universe long before Western traditions really acknowledged how large the universe is. And I gather that according to the Vedic tradition, there are hundreds of thousands of different kinds of humanoid beings who live on other planets or in other hyperspatial dimensions.
Yes, and even other universes. There's not just one, according to the Vedic understanding. There's an expansion of the original personality of Godhead called Mahavishnu, who is responsible for manifesting the material universes. This Mahavishnu, it is stated, lies sleeping on the cosmic ocean, the causal ocean, and he's dreaming. And as he breathes out, millions of universes expand from the pores of the skin of his body. And when he breathes in, the universes come back into his body. And when the universes are manifest, he injects with his glance souls that are fit for existing in the material world rather than the spiritual world. So each one of those breaths lasts 311 trillion years. So you're right. There are immense periods of time, vast cycles of creation and destruction, not just of one universe, but of many. It's a real challenge to our current mentality.
Many people might think that, so much that we see in mythology, it's meant to be taken figuratively, or it's the product of poetic imagination and primitive mythological thinking. But today we have a whole host of fringe phenomenon. You've reported extensively on the fringe phenomenon known in archaeology, but also in the field of UFO research. We have, and parapsychology, all these fringe phenomena that seem to be in accord with the Vedic tradition.
Yes, absolutely. Of course, one has to proceed step by step, but I'll even point out that modern cosmology and astrophysics have been moving in the Vedic direction. Now there's the concept of the multiverse, or many worlds or many universes theory, which is something that was always there in the Vedic cosmology. You could say it's just a coincidence, but I think there are too many of these coincidences, like the idea of an expanding universe. That's there in the Vedic cosmology. When the universes emerge from the Mahavishnu, they're in small seed-like form. And then they're energized by the glance of Mahavishnu, and they expand. So the expanding universe is something that modern cosmology has come up with, modern astrophysics. And also a contracting universe. They call it the Big Bang and the Big Bounce. That, the universes expand and then they contract again. That idea is also there in the Vedic cosmology. And as I said, modern science has no comprehensive understanding of the origin of consciousness. In the Vedic cosmology, it's built in to the whole system, and many modern cosmologists are starting to think about that consciousness may be a property of matter. They're trying to accommodate it in that way.
Well, if I were to look at the Vedic tradition and ask myself, how is it distinguished from other ancient traditions that have given us maps or pictures of the universe, one of the first things that would come to mind is the science and practice of yoga and meditation seems to be much more highly developed in the Vedic traditions and its offshoot of Buddhism than one would find in the Judeo-Christian tradition or shamanistic traditions or other religious variations.
You're right that the concepts may be more highly developed in the Vedic system of thought and practice, but they are also features of the worldviews of other wisdom traditions. In one of my books, Human Devolution, I included a chapter which I called Cross-Cultural Study of Cosmologies, where I looked at about 40 of the world's wisdom traditions and cultures, widely separated in time and space. And practically every one of them has similar features in the sense that they involve some acknowledgement of the primacy of consciousness and personality in the universe, that we're part of a whole cosmic hierarchy of beings, that there are connections between terrestrial humans and beings that exist on higher levels of reality, that there is a conscious self that can travel out of the body on, as you said, shamanic journeys and other types of things. So although you may notice some differences of degree, I think some of the basic elements are there in practically all of these wisdom traditions. And I think that's because they're looking at the same reality from different points of view.
Well, with regard to UFO phenomena, I think one can find examples of flying devices in pretty much every tradition, in particular folk traditions, but they're very elaborate in the Vedic tradition. In fact, they're so elaborate, one is inclined to think it's the product of a fanciful imagination. For example, the Vimanas, that are described, the flying machines in the Vedic culture, some of them are thought to be as large as a temple itself or a palace itself, flying palaces, even flying cities.
Yes, that's a fact. Such things exist. And, some modern inventors and scientists and others are proposing such things. Of course, it may be in the realm of science fiction, but to me, it's very interesting that if one were to propose, well, these descriptions are simply imagination, well, it's kind of interesting that the things that are imagined turn out to be things that people today either observe in modern UFO phenomena, or that they correspond to the kinds of things that our scientists and technologists are proposing to build, actual technologies that we have. I think it's important to realize that there are different kinds of Vimanas described in the ancient Vedic text. The basic cosmological division in the Vedic cosmology is that there's a terrestrial level with ordinary physical elements. There's a more subtle intermediate realm with subtle mental and intellectual energies. And then there's the realm of pure consciousness or spirit. And each level has its different kind of Vimana or craft. Some are material, made of material elements, technology. Others are more subtle, produced by yogic, mystic powers. And some are of a completely different nature, totally non-material.
I gather that some of the Vimanas described in the Vedic tradition seem very much like modern airplanes. They have wings like birds. I think maybe the wings even flap like birds. I think people have sometimes referred to that as an ornithopter.
Yes, there are such things described in some of especially the medieval Sanskrit literature on these things. There are things that resemble modern aircraft. It's stated, for example, that they have wings. They're made of very light wood. And some of the early airplanes that were invented in Western Europe and the United States were also manufactured with very light woods and things like that. So, but what makes the medieval Vimanas of India interesting is that it said they were powered by mercury-fueled engines, which is kind of interesting. That would be a difference. However, there are other Vimanas that resemble not ordinary flying craft with wings, but objects that more resemble some of the modern UFO kinds of reports. For example, the flying machine that was used by the king Shalva, who was on the side of the forces of darkness, to attack the city of Dwarka, which about 5,000 years ago was a center of, you could say, the forces of light and good on earth. An avatar of God, Krishna, appeared there and was ruling the place. So this Vimana was obtained by King Shalva from a higher being among the Asuras, or the demoniac forces in the universe. It's kind of an early example of interplanetary technology transfer, which many modern ufologists talk about, that a lot of our technology has been developed by contact with extraterrestrial beings. So you have things like that. I could go on for a long time about the Vimana that King Shalva used to attack the city of Dwarka, because it has many features that are currently being developed by modern militaries, for example.
Yes, let's if you would elaborate on the story, I think that would be quite interesting.
So this King Shalva, an Asura, got this technology from a being called Mayadanava, who was the engineer of the demoniac forces in the universe. So he gave him this Vimana made of metals to attack the city of Dwarka. And he used weapons that in one sense are described as arrows and spears, but in the descriptions that are given, it's stated when he released this arrow, it roared through the sky and appeared like a bolt of lightning shooting through the atmosphere. And the weapon was countered by the forces below in the city of Dwarka with weapons that, again, were described as arrows or spears, but they're obviously not a thin stick of wood with a metal tip on it. The way that they're described resemble modern anti-missile missiles. So it's really quite interesting. And this craft that Shalva was operating, it could appear in several places at once, and it could appear and disappear as well from the vision of the defenders of the city below. And this resembles exactly modern UFO reports of how these things, they appear and disappear. They have flight movements that are very difficult to account for. And it's also something that we see in modern military technologies. For example, they design nuclear warheads that are attached to intercontinental ballistic missiles that can try to deceive radar and other detection methods by giving out false signals. So you don't know which one is the real warhead, that needs to be shot down. It's kind of interesting that, if you would say, well, this is all just imagination. It seems to be imagination that conforms in many ways to things that are being developed these days. Also, this machine, this Vimana, had the ability to project holographic images. So it's really an interesting kind of story. Krishna was fighting with King Shalva, who had beamed down from the Vimana that was hovering over the city of Dwarka. And during the battle, this King Shalva, he produced Krishna's father. And he said, I've captured your father, Krishna, and I'm going to cut off his head. And he did that, held the head up, and then was beamed back up into the Vimana. And then Krishna noticed that the body of his father, so-called, had disappeared, and he understood it wasn't a real body. It was an image projected by the machine. So, I find this fascinating. If it's all just imagination, it's pretty good. Kind of like Galileo or Leonardo da Vinci. He had a good imagination. He was able to come up with ideas that are just now being manifested in actual physical form.
Surely we know that human imagination is a very powerful thing, and many great inventions started out as in the imaginary mind of fictional authors. The submarine, for example, was described extensively by Jules Verne before it was ever built, and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. But the sense from the Vedic tradition, and I believe there are many adherents who take it quite literally, is that these things actually happened in very ancient times in physical reality as we know it.
I'm certainly number myself among that category, that I think these things actually did exist. And one demonstration of that is that even today, very trained observers like military jet pilots, commercial airline pilots, and others, astronomers, other people with training, have observed and reported such things. So that to me is a confirmation of the reality of the phenomena. It's interesting that some of these people who report these things that are described in the ancient Sanskrit writings of India have total lack of familiarity with that literature. They know absolutely nothing about the ancient reports. And the fact that these ancient reports match up with the modern UFO alien abduction types of reports, I think is a sign that we're talking about something real.
Well, as a parapsychologist myself, I'm very interested in the intersection between human psychic abilities, or what in the Vedic tradition might be thought of as the siddhis, and UFO phenomenon. I've even done extensive research with an individual I wrote about in a book called The PK Man, who said that he had been operated on. His brain had been operated on by alien entities, and he was given extraordinary powers. Amongst those powers was the ability to summon UFOs, which he demonstrated on multiple occasions, including for me in very dramatic ways. So the Vedic traditions seem to go to great lengths to talk about the psychic or psychological dimension of the UFO phenomenon. These are craft, for example, that can be controlled entirely through concentration.
Yes, even the craft of Shalva is called Kama Ga. Ga means to go, Kama means by one's will. So yes, these craft, these vimanas, could be controlled mentally. And again, this is something that modern military technology is developing. The current generation of fighter aircraft travel at such speeds that it's almost impossible to control them by ordinary movements of hands and feet, to try to control the aircraft. So they they have tried to develop sensors that allow the pilot to control the craft mentally or by eye movements rather than physical movements. So that ability was there, and as far as the paranormal element goes, sometimes even the manufacture of the manas, especially by higher beings, is in that category. There was the flying city type of Vimana that was manifested by the sage Kardama Muni. There's a description of that in the Bhagavad Purana. It's just mentally he was able to manifest the flying city, and he and his wife went on a journey, a tour of the universe in this Vimana, which was like you've mentioned, a flying palace. But it wasn't made by mining minerals from the earth, refining them into metals in a factory, hammering them together to produce a machine. It was produced mentally, and it could be controlled mentally. And a really interesting feature of it, I'll note, from the Bhagavad Purana, is that within this flying palace, there were gardens and animals and birds. And some of the birds, it's stated directly in the text, were machines. They were robots. And they were so realistic that the living birds would fly up to them and try to interact with them like a live bird. And I found it kind of interesting that modern military technology, they develop drones for surveillance. And, if you have a regular mechanical drone and the people that you're trying to observe see it, they can understand what it is. So the Army in particular has developed drones that look like birds. And when they're flying, they get attacked by hawks that think they're other birds. So I found that kind of interesting, that this idea of robot birds, so real that real birds approach them, is there in the Bhagavad Purana in Sanskrit, and it's also there in latest military technology reports. I find that fascinating.
Well, you mentioned that there are different levels in the Vedic tradition. You have the idea that there are countless planets in which there will be living biological creatures like ourselves, probably humanoid and more or less, and at different levels of technology and levels of spiritual evolution. But then there are these higher beings, the devas, the angelic beings, or the demonic beings, the asuras, and they also have technology, but in addition to their technology, they have powers of the mind itself, cities, where they can manifest. They don't need technology because of their advanced spiritual powers.
Yes, that's absolutely true of some of them. And that paranormal aspect is definitely there in the UFO accounts of modern times as well. I've been following the UFO field for many years now, and I could see a while back that a lot of the UFO researchers were in what we call the nuts and bolts category. They were just looking for mechanical technology made by other human-like beings on other planets. And then some of them began getting into the more paranormal stuff, especially connected with the abduction phenomenon, where people would describe, they'd be sleeping at night and they'd wake up and a beam of light would be shining on them and they'd be floated through a wall and up into some kind of craft where they were subjected to medical investigations and probes of their bodies, and then somehow they would be returned. So that paranormal element began to enter into UFO, extraterrestrial types of investigations. And that is something that is also, as you pointed out, there in the Vedic conception of things as well. The ability to manifest these cities or mystic powers, being able to, as you say, travel from level to level and place to place in the universe. And sometimes this involves weird transformations of time and space. You know, for example, in the Puranas, there's the story of King Kukudmi, who had a daughter, Revati, and he was interested in seeing that she found a good husband. He was thinking, well, this prince seems like a good match. Maybe this king, he's pretty young and powerful, he'd be a good match. So he decided, well, let me go up to the planet of Brahma, the chief demigod, chief Sura. And he did that. He went with his daughter up to the planet of Brahma, and he was told by the doorkeeper there, well, he's busy right now, but he'll be right with you in a moment or two. And then Brahma came after a few minutes and asked the king what he wanted. And he said, well, I'm considering different possibilities for a husband for my daughter. And he began listing the names of the different kings and princes. And Brahma told him, well, you know, in the small time you've been here, millions of years have passed on Earth, and everybody that you're talking about is dead and gone a long time. So anyways, we'll arrange things so your daughter will find a proper match or soulmate or whatever. And so he went back to Earth after millions of years had passed.
One of the other aspects of the Vedic tradition, which does seem to be in accordance with reports from UFO experiencers, is the idea that these UFOs may not necessarily all originate from outer space and other planets. The thought is that a couple of things. There could be parallel dimensions that are essentially right here on Earth, but parallel to the three dimensions we normally experience, or even within the three-dimensional reality we experience, but just somehow hidden beneath the ocean or in caves somewhere or in Antarctica where we haven't yet discovered them.
Yes. Well, that gets you into sacred geography. There can be a geography that contains elements that aren't visible by ordinary human sense perception. And for example, if we look at the Vedic descriptions of even the earthly planetary level of reality, there's a vision of it that's quite different from what we generally perceive. And it's called in this vision, Bhumandala, the Earth Circle, which involves our Earth being part of a central island, circular island, or mandala, with a gold mountain in the center of it, called Mount Meru. And beyond that, our Earth is just part of that central island of Bhumandala, which is inhabited by all kinds of other beings with higher powers, things like that. And then there's a ring ocean around it. And then there's a ring island. There's a whole sequence of ring oceans and islands around Jambudweep, which is where our Earth planet is located according to this sacred geography. And the beings are of a different nature entirely. So, yeah, there may be hidden aspects of even our current level of reality with beings with different sorts of powers that we would regard as mystical somehow, and with technologies that may be based on other principles than our own. Yeah, so I would say yes, Jeffrey, perhaps there are dimensions to even our present terrestrial reality that we're not fully aware of.
So we're talking about a cosmology then that includes highly evolved spiritual beings. It includes a wide array of physical beings from other planets at different levels of spiritual and technological evolution. It includes evolved humans like ourselves, sages and yogis, who have developed many attainments on this realm, and all of these beings are interacting with each other and have been interacting with each other for thousands of years.
Millions of years. What it does is, I think it engenders a sense of humility, that we're not the masters of the universe, so to speak, that there are other factors that need to be considered, that just like in any city that we live in, we have water, we have electricity, we have so many things that we take for granted, and we don't recognize that there are highly intelligent engineers and people that are responsible for us having these things we take so much for granted, like electricity, power, communications, food, so many things. So actually, according to the Vedic cosmology, our whole universe is arranged like that. There are demigods, suras, who are in charge of providing what we regard as the necessities of life in the cosmos. So this is, if this is forgotten, then we get in trouble. Just like when there's some big natural disaster, then we suddenly appreciate, the people and engineers and others who have supplied us with water, with electricity, and other things. So, and if we misuse these things, then things are pretty bad. You wind up in big trouble, like climate change, because of our misuse of resources in an unsustainable way and things like that. But there's more to it than just the physical misuse of resources. If the demigods aren't satisfied with the way that we're behaving, they may restrict our access to certain resources. That's part of the Vedic cosmology as well, that there is a necessity for recognizing these entities and properly relating with them.
In other words, you're suggesting that there's a hierarchy and a kind of a cosmological order to things.
Yes, and I think that's part of a great many wisdom traditions in the world. They recognize that. The alternative is to think, well, there's nothing in control of it. We're accidental beings existing in an accidental universe, and it's just ours to make what we want of it. And let's just compete with each other to see who comes out on top. China, Russia, the United States, whatever.
You've given me a lot of food for thought today, Michael. I have one other question I'd like to pursue with you. In the Western tradition, in particular the Western spiritualist tradition, and in many other religions, there's a sense of ancestor worship, that our ancestors, once they die, they are in heaven, they are closer to the deity, and they become like angelic figures who mediate between our world and higher spiritual realms. But in the Vedic tradition, my understanding is that reincarnation is considered more what happens after death, and so that ancestor worship wouldn't be appropriate in a culture that accepts reincarnation. And I wonder if you have any reflections on that.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting point. I would say it's a little more complex than you've put it, because there is a kind of ancestor worship in traditional Vedic or Hindu thought. And it has to do with the concept of offering what's called Shraddha. And Shraddha means an offering to a departed soul. And even in reincarnation, there's a difficulty that can occur. When a soul leaves a body, it goes along with the soul goes its subtle mental body. And according to the state of the subtle mental body, one will get another gross physical body in the next life. That's what reincarnation is. However, what can sometimes happen is that a soul will leave its gross physical body at the time of death, along with its mental body, in which its desires and ambitions are stored. And it won't get another gross physical body. It will remain in the form of what we would call a ghost, which means it has all of its desires, but no machinery to carry them out. So sometimes, to ensure against the possibility that that does not happen to one's relative who has departed, one's ancestor, you could say, there is a specific yajna or sacrifice or ceremony that is performed, this Shraddha offering. And there's even a city in India that's completely dedicated to that, like a pilgrimage place where people go to specifically offer that Shraddha ceremony and to deliver their ancestor from the possibility of having to remain somewhere as a ghost. So it's not completely absent from the Vedic tradition.
Because it strikes me that if we accept that there are biological entities like ourselves on many other planets, that to the extent that humans have other realms, as you mentioned, a mental realm, a causal realm, an astral realm, which is described in the Upanishads, or the Bardo planes as described in Buddhism,
Yes.
Extraterrestrial beings, if they're highly evolved, would be aware of this as well. And in fact, there are many accounts in the UFO literature of interactions between deceased humans and extraterrestrial entities.
Yes, you're absolutely right about that. There's actually a whole system for handling souls that leave bodies, determining their next destination, what planet or level they'll be on, what type of body they'll have. You could say that in the Vedic cosmology, the whole universe or system of universes is an arrangement for moving souls, conscious selves, from one level to another, from one type of body to another. And there are beings, higher beings, that are connected with that. There's Yamaraj, for example, the Lord of Death. It's stated that at the time of death, a soul, a conscious self, will be taken to the court of Yamaraj, and they'll have the record of the activities that one performed in one's past life, and they'll go through that record with the soul, and they'll, on the basis of that, they'll be taken to another planet or return to the Earth planet and given a certain type of body in a certain family or species of life. And there are higher beings called Yamadutas, who are the servants of Yamaraj, that kind of arrange for the transportation of the conscious self. And then there are Vishnudutas, representatives of the supreme conscious being, who sometimes interfere in these things because sometimes the Yamadutas make mistakes. They don't take the right soul. They make a mistake or a misjudgment about what the destination of the soul is. Is it to higher realms or lower realms? And these Vishnudutas will intervene. Now, there's one account in the Bhagavad Purana of a person named Ajamil. At the time of death, when his soul was leaving his body, you say the Yamadutas came and were taking it away. It's kind of like the bad cops, you could say, were taking him away. And the Vishnudutas came and said, no, you can't take him. He's done some really spiritual things. He looks like a very bad guy, but his heart's in the right place. So what happened is that he had a near-death experience. Like he died, but he was allowed back in his body, and he kind of cleaned up his act a little bit, and then at the end of his life, he went to a good place, you could say.
Michael Cremo, I want to thank you very much for this conversation. You've certainly presented a big picture within which so many the diverse technological and paranormal developments that are coming to the fore now can be understood. So I very much appreciate having this time with you.
It's really always an amazing experience for me to be speaking with you. You draw things out of me sometimes that I don't even expect myself.
Well, thank you very much for being with me, Michael. And for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.